to be purpose-driven. You need to have a strong reason. Why do you exist?
We're still growing and still learning.
For me, there's no place like home.
I mean, I feel like we met last year at Elevate talking about the measurement work you're doing. But I feel like to get to measurement, you have to do a lot of work first, right? And so I want to go like way back in your journey and start with, where did storytelling become something you were interested in?
Okay. If we're going to go way, way back, I love theater. I've always loved theater. I was a child actor. Literally.
Yes.
I was Annie in a national tour of Annie when I was 11 years old.
That's not a little thing. That's
I know.
Okay.
Like,
that's a real child.
Like
that's a real child actor.
It's a wild thing that now, like, I don't want to reveal my age, but now this many years later, I look back on that and think like that was a really different life. And I actually did that as a kid, which is very strange. But I think that theater and audience and storytelling and my love for it all began in the world of theater and performance. And so I wanted to be an actor. And as I got older and eventually in school, I ended up studying theater, but also political science. And I moved into the world of being what it means to be an adult actor, and just the lifestyle of that was not for me. I tend to be a little more of a type A person. I like to have a plan. I like control, and the life of an actor is not that at all. I did end up marrying an actor though, and so I still get to ride that journey a little bit. But what I found that I loved about theater was the story, was crafting something, was putting it in front of people, getting a reaction, watching change happen after an audience had consumed the content or watched a performance. And so this idea of storytelling and the communities that form around storytelling has been a part of what I'm passionate about forever. And it sort of transitioned into, how do I move that into a different medium? And so what ended up happening was when I was in college, I would switch internships that I would go for each summer. One summer I would look to do a theater internship, and one summer I would look to do something associated with the world of political science. What I ended up doing was interning at MSNBC, and I did that for a few years. And I think there's a saying that like news and politics is movies for ugly people. It's fine. But I really liked it. I really liked the idea that news is about storytelling for impact. And that it is really critical to helping people make decisions, to keeping people informed about what's happening in the world around them and how it affects their everyday lives, from how they plan for their family, how they decide, where they want to go, what they want to be. Politics, of course, is a big part of it, but just the sort of universe of news felt like a really, really interesting storytelling with purpose mechanism for me. So after college, I eventually decided that the world of theater wasn't for me. And I am a firm believer in relationship building. And thankfully, I had stayed in touch with the people that I had worked with during my internship times at MSNBC, and was able to eventually get a job as a lowly PA on the weekend shift, which meant that I worked 4 a.m. to 4 p.m. on Fridays and Saturdays. And then a slightly more generous schedule of, I think, like 6 a.m. to, I don't know, something in the early afternoon on 3 additional weekdays. So I was working this graveyard shift. but it taught me so much about efficiency, about speed, about detail and fact finding and doing it quickly, and seeing what the immediate response from an audience was like. That sort of, the applause that you get in theater, you hear that immediately when you're working in the world of news, whether that's from comments online, whether that's from the next day's ratings. So you immediately sort of understand the impact the work that you're doing is having. And that I was really, really interesting to me and rewarding. And, I think that I may have begun that journey thinking that being a news anchor was the thing that I wanted to do. But what I learned within my first few years at MSNBC was that there's so much more goes into journalism and a cable news network and a digital arm of a cable news network than anchor and writer, anchor and producer. I ended up working for Phil Griffin, who was the president of MSNBC at the time, and this dates me. But through him, which sort of became almost a grad school experience for me, I was introduced to the world of marketing, to sales, to research, to planning, and programming, and so design. And so once I saw just how much goes into television, and yes, absolutely news, but just the television universe, it opened my eyes to a lot of different ways that I could contribute to this world of story, and gave me a sort of open path for a lot of different directions that I could take it in. And eventually, at the time, it was the sort of burgeoning days of Twitter, and we were very slow, as most news organizations were, to experimenting with social media. And I was the young kid at the time, and I said, I want to go experiment with this. And the bosses said, yeah, sure, it's not going to hurt anybody, and go over there in the corner and play around with it. And at the time, the first big thing that we did was called the Twicker, where we convinced the newsroom to put tweets on the bottom of the screen.
I remember those
to
days,
go along
yeah.
to be alongside the story that we were telling during a breaking news scenario, or to give real-time reactions to this. Anyway, that was very, very radical. Very radical at the time. But it was exciting because it was something that I was seeing a white space for and was given the freedom to creatively explore it and think about how does that change the way that we tell stories? How does it change the way that we interact with audiences? And then just keep evolving it from there. And so I moved into the digital team at MSNBC. I ended up managing MSNBC.com during a time when it was transitioning from a joint venture with Microsoft to being wholly owned by NBC News. That was a whole world of community building around major personalities like Rachel Maddow and Chris Hayes, which was very, very exciting. And in that role, we looked to explore not just video content and the cable news programs as they aired on linear TV, but how could we start to atomize that content for distribution on digital as the world of digital video was beginning to explode and as audio is beginning to take hold, and how do we think about the audience in all the different places where they consume their content and make access to it more democratized and accessible. So I spent about 10 years at NBC News and MSNBC before I started to pivot more to the brand storytelling side of the world.
I can fully resonate with your journey because I did about the same thing. working a 2 a.m. shift in a
Uh-huh.
newsroom
Oh, yeah,
and
it's brutal.
running the floor cameras in a studio,
Oh, yeah.
and then traveling through the journalism world. I'd be curious, as you sort of, where you are now and you reflect at that time,
Mm.
what did you learn from news and journalism about storytelling that you still hold really foundationally?
Yeah, I mean, I think fact finding and verification and doing the work to get to the truth of a story is really ingrained in everything I do. And especially now working at the BBC, where impartiality is one of our core tenets. Like that harkens back to early days of how are we sourcing stories and ensuring that we feel confident and comfortable in what we are telling our audience because they're relying on us. I think that applies to brands as well. And there's, there can be a reluctance for brands to open the kimono, if you will, operating from a place of fear. But I think that when you have access and are working with a brand partner that is willing to show what they've got and work with a producer and a publisher who's experienced in navigating stories and showing perhaps the uglier parts, but in a smart way to tell a story about progress. That's where really interesting work gets done. And so, I think that research-based background that I have has helped me work with brands and help me explain to them the how and the why doing things not in an airbrushed fashion can actually be incredibly beneficial to them, even though it might feel a little scary at first.
I feel like I spend more time than not like banging on the conflict drum.
Yes,
Like without tension, it's not a story.
It's nothing. You
right?
want to see the before and then the kind of messy middle and then the after the resolve. That makes the resolve that much more exciting and actually authentic, which is really, that's all that you hear with content, especially brand content: authenticity, authenticity, authenticity. You can't manufacture that. You have to go through that journey to actually get there.
Stepping away from news and into the brand space, where did you go?
How did I do that?
And what was it about the brand space that was interesting to you? Because I feel like journalists have a hard time making that transition because you go
The
from
ugly,
a world,
the dark side,
the ugly dark side,
capitalism,
and leaving a place where you're supposed to leave your biases at the door.
Yeah.
Doesn't always happen, but like that's a lot of us as journalists are trained to like, how do I look at this from both sides? How do I see, all the aspects of the story and tell it? I feel like there's a perception, and it may even be a misperception, that brands are like, no, we're doing it,
Right.
we're only looking at the things through our lens.
Right. Yep.
So for you, what was that process of stepping into the brand world and then trying to tell stories from that space?
Yeah. So there came a time in the late teens where I was feeling pretty burned out in working in a 24-hour breaking news cycle. I tell this story, and it's true. We were covering maybe the third or fourth school shooting of the year. And I had just had my son. He's now 10. He was, I think, 1.5 at the time. And I found myself going into sort of work by numbers mode. Do we have the headline? Have we sourced it? Who has the photo? Have we tweeted it out yet? Like checking boxes in this incredibly tragic moment. And I stepped away from that and thought, that's not how I want to interact with the world of news anymore and the world around me. Like I'm feeling emotionally numb. And when something that awful happens, if you're not engaging with it as a human, like seeing the humanity in that, it felt like that was stripped away from me a bit. And I wanted to be able to be an observer and participant in the world, with the emotions that are normal to experience when those things are
Yeah.
happening. And I was also really tired. Working in news is, especially in digital in news, is a 24-hour-a-day job, or can be. And I had a young child at the time, and, your perspective on how you want to spend your time and the balance that you want to have and the satisfaction that you get from your work starts to shift as you enter the world, or at least as I entered the world of parenting. And so I knew that it was time to make a change. I just wasn't quite sure what it would be. I ended up moving from NBC to the Skimm, which was or is a media company. It was a startup at the time, that is targeted at millennial women. And their core was a daily newsletter focused on the day's news. But at the time that I joined them, they were looking to expand into other verticals, and they were looking to expand beyond the newsletter platform, which was their core, and they were very, very good at it, to audio, to web, to video, expanding into social. And so it felt like a really good opportunity to not only leave the world of breaking news, but join a company that had a very strong brand voice, that knew exactly who they were and was looking to try new things. And as a part of that, they were also stepping into the world of brand content and thinking with brand partners about how they could marry together their incredibly engaged millennial women audience with the brands that really wanted to reach them, but in an authentic way. And so that was my first taste of how do we marry a brand with the voice and the audience that that a publisher has, and start to create really interesting things that that audience would actually want to consume. And so that was my first taste of that. And I really liked it because what I found was the brands that we were working with, because they knew that we knew our audience so well, were willing to say, you do what you do best. This is what we want to talk about. You create the story, you shape it in the way that you know your audience is going to want to engage with it and is going to benefit from it. And we were selective with the brands that we worked with, but that allowed us to create really interesting storytelling in the voice of the Skimm. It felt very organic. It felt very natural to the audience. And that's when I started to learn that the world of storytelling is super rich, and it doesn't have to be news to tell interesting stories that add value to an audience's life. So from the Skimm, my first taste of brand content and brand storytelling, I then made a big leap over to WeWork. And this was post the change up of leadership
Yep.
at WeWork, so post Adam Newman's era.
Yep.
And they brought me on to lead global content. And that was so helpful because it was the first time that I had ever actually sat within a brand and thought about, as a brand, what kind of stories do we want to tell about ourselves? And that was a content studio in the brand. It's like we had our own writers, we were homegrown and we were creating it. And we did some work with outside agencies and outside partners, but really it was a newsroom, if you will, within WeWork, talking about the world of real estate and hybrid work around COVID. So that was my first taste of doing it within a brand. And then an opportunity came up with the BBC that just absolutely married both worlds, because I was able to walk back into a media organization, which I had grown up in, but not in the newsroom, walk into a content marketing and ad sales division, understand how the media network works, understand the principles that go into great storytelling and journalism, and also understand the needs of a brand. And so now I sit in this role where I marry those two things together by leading a brand studio backed by BBC, which is one of the greatest media organizations in the world.
Before I dive into the BBC work, I'd be curious, was there anything on the brand side running the WeWork studio that surprised you or you wish you had known about earlier?
Well, when I walked into the WeWork studio, it was a daunting task because they had originally built their content around the idea of like vibes
Right.
and being cool,
Yeah.
which meant that the content that they were creating were things like music reviews and book reviews, and it had very, very little to do with WeWork's products. And it wasn't proving return for the brand. And so there was a question of, why are we doing this? What are we doing this for? And so over my time there, we transitioned to find interesting ways to talk about the world of work, the science behind sharing space, hub and spoke models, 15-minute cities, things that were relevant to the product that WeWork had. And I learned so much about thought leadership that I did not really have any experience with prior to that. And that started to help me connect the dots from how content and story, when it's targeted at the right audience, can actually connect you back to revenue. It was the first time that I truly had been measured by how many leads did this help us generate? How did we drive opportunity for our sales team off of that white paper that you produced? And that's real measurement that when you're in the world of editorial, you're not always thinking about. And so that was incredibly helpful and new.
Stepping into the BBC, I feel like so many of us know the BBC because of so much of their documentary and news work.
Yeah.
When you took the role and you were looking at how do we bring brand and, I'll call it editorial,
Yeah.
but you may have a different word. I feel like there's a credibility that comes with the
Yeah.
brand that, I mean, it's really powerful.
Yep.
But how do you balance that with brands looking to tell stories to sort of, I don't know, verify feels like the wrong word, but like to make sure you're not publishing things that don't align with BBC standards at the
Yep.
same time? Like, what is that balance and how did you learn to navigate that?
Yeah. So, we don't call it editorial. It is very much editorial in style. And that is because the BBC, as you mentioned, and as they should be, is incredibly protective of their editorial integrity. And we have a very strict line. There's, never the two shall cross. But what we are held to with the storytelling that we produce on behalf of brands are the same standards of fact checking and sourcing. We have very stringent compliance guidelines that are put in place to protect not only the BBC but the brands. Because if we falsely represent or sugarcoat something because that's what a brand wants to do, it will ultimately hurt them as well. And I get the sense from the brands that we work with that part of the reason why they're coming to us is not only because they know that there is absolutely a halo effect of trust that happens when they're positioned in our orbit, but that they can trust us that we will do the story justice and do it the right way. So it's a mutually beneficial value that we build off of this long heritage and reputation that the organization has.
I mentioned at the very beginning, we met through this exploration of measurement.
Yeah.
And I feel like, we're at Sundance for brand storytelling, and like the first question on every panel is like, well, that was really great, but what's the ROI? Or that was really great, but how are you measuring it? I'd be really curious to know from the BBC side, when did you start looking at, we need a tool to measure this, and like views and clicks isn't the thing we want to be measuring?
Yeah. Well, so one thing I'll note is being here. It's funny, we were just in our panel, and we said the word data, and I think it was Mark Battaglia who was moderating, said, brace yourselves, everyone. It's not gonna hurt you, this data story. But the thing is, I have my roots as a creator. I'm hitting this microphone, sorry. I have my roots as a creator, but what I have found is that when I have data, it gives me more freedom and confidence in what I want to produce, or what I want to, strategically guide my teams to produce, because there's comfort in knowing there's a precedent for how this is going to go. And sometimes having that research and that data, like, it creates a sandbox to play in, as opposed to a wide open beach where like anything could happen, and like that is kind of scary. So there is a lot of freedom that comes along, creative freedom that comes along with having the data and the insights that I've come to love over time. I don't know. I think that it just was becoming apparent, both in the editorial work that I was doing and as I moved to the brand side, that the question of, okay, so it got a lot of likes or got a lot of engagement. So what? So what? Kept coming back, and I didn't have a good way to answer that. And I knew that at the BBC, we had been using a tool that we call science of engagement for a while to get a better understanding of the performance of our brand films, as a means to like add data to our wrap report that, people liked it. People liked it, and here's how we know that they liked it. But what I started to see through that tool was that there was so much more that we could do with it to actually connect the dots, not only for the brands that we were working with, but for the sort of industry at large, that there is a real connection between emotion and memory encoding, and then performance outcomes that we heard brands wanting to reach and wanting to have measurability against. And what that did is it changed the dynamic for us in how we talked about what performance would look like when we were in our pitch phase. Because if their KPI was going to be brand positivity, or a lift in brand awareness and brand positivity, we could say, okay, we have a structure and we have some precedent now in the type of stories that we tell, the format that we tell those stories, with data demonstrating it, linking right back to brand positivity. Or if the goal is purchase intent, we can go back and look through our trove of films and understand the trends in the formats and the emotions that we trigger that directly connect to purchase intent. And that has resonated in a way that is so much more powerful than saying we will deliver you likes or we will deliver you impressions. Not to, poo-poo on impressions. That's important. Reach is important. If you're not reaching people, people don't see the content, then it doesn't matter how emotionally engaging it is. But it is additive to it, because the same question about likes, it got a zillion impressions. Great. So what did that get me? Well, if I can tell you that impressions on the content that also increased purchase intent, then you can actually connect it back to the revenue and the products that were moved, or the leads that were generated off of that in a way that we hadn't been able to previously. And I don't know, it feels like we're right on the edge of industry-wide having better language and vocabulary to give an answer to why should I invest in this? Because there is science that connects it. It's not just about feel good anymore. But I think it's been a journey for us as brand storytellers and as a community to find the tools to prove that out. And now that technology is allowing us to do that, I think it's going to move this industry a lot further forward.
I mean, I feel like a lot of us storytellers will default to like the storytelling mechanisms, right? We mentioned conflict before, like stories have to have conflict or no one's going to care or watch it or there's no stakes. I'd be curious in navigating this tool that's looking at emotion and engagement and how are people our audience is participating in it.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the learnings you have found that you think more brands or storytellers should be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, we have found that when the brand is a little quieter, not silent, but quieter in the background, letting the subjects of, if it's essentially a case study story, if you let that person shine, it's about them, it's about the problem that they had, that before, the messy middle, and the after. We don't talk about the product itself, talk about the person who's going through that experience. Results have always been higher. We talk about human-centered storytelling. There's a film that we produced for a technology company in Asia. It was a mobile technology company, and it's phones. And so, you think, okay, well, we'll center the story around the phone, or that's what a brand likely walks into thinking. But instead, we found the story of a gentleman who had been diagnosed with ALS and had essentially lost the ability to communicate verbally or physically. And what we ended up doing was telling a story about him and what his life was like before and the diagnosis that he had. And we didn't say it, but we showed him now in his wheelchair, but with a phone propped up, and then told the story about how he's using eye tracking technology to communicate with his family and his friends, and actually now create artwork through AI and through prompts that he gives to a generative AI tool by using his eyes through this phone. But we never talked about the phone brand. We didn't zoom in on the phone to make sure the product shot was there, but it was very quietly integrated into this gentleman Bernard's story. And we found that the affinity for that mobile technology company jumped by, I think it was like 85, 90%. Like, it really made a huge leap. And so did purchase intent. And we didn't tell anyone to go buy a phone. And so I think the lesson from that, and when we work with brands, is we use this idea of find the person who's impacted by your product, by your service, and tell their story, and they'll do the work for you.
Love it. Okay, before I let you go,
Mm-hmm.
I've got my rapid fire,
Oh,
not so
boy.
rapid fire,
Okay.
rapid fires.
Okay.
What is one story that had an impact on your life and why?
One
One
story?
story. Any medium. And I feel like you may have some life experience stories in a different way than others.
One story that had impact on my life and why. I think that when I was, it's not a media, it's not a television story.
Yeah.
It's a human to human story.
Yeah.
When I was making the transition from theater into new career, it was really, really scary. And I was on a bus home from a summer stock show that I had done, and I was reading backstage, which dates me even more. But there used to be a newspaper that you would read to see like what shows were coming up and what auditions you should go to. And I was reading it, and it was promoting that there was a new tour of the show Fiddler on the Roof, which is, as a theater lover, as a Jewish person, a show that has resonated with me for years. I've loved that story. It connects with me very deeply, from tradition to the family values, and it's just meaningful to me and my father as well. So I've loved that story and that show forever. And I saw in this trade paper that they were having an audition for a new tour of this show. And I didn't want to audition because I was just sort of done with the roller coaster of what it is to be a working actor. And I thought to myself, that story has persisted. The show Fiddler on the Roof has persisted for 50 years now. It was around when I was a child. It is coming back now that I'm a young adult. It will persist. And so if I decide now I'm done with pursuing theater, and in a few years I realize, no, I've made a terrible mistake, that story of Fiddler on the Roof will be around. It'll come back again because it's so powerful as a show, as a history piece. It's not going away. It's that powerful. And so for me, if I walk away from theater right now and I come back 10 years later, chances are there will be another production of Fiddler on the Roof because it's that good. And so it gave me the freedom to know it was okay to step away. Yeah, I don't know. So I
love
so
it.
so that's sort of a story within a story. I love the story of that show, but also it helped me make a change in my career.
Yeah, I love it. What is one film you think everyone should watch?
Film ever? Does it have to be a brand film, or can it be any film?
Any film, but that you think others need to see.
Film that I think others need to see. Can I go in like the backlog, like the archive?
You can go anywhere you want. We've had some deep cuts.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think everyone needs to see Big.
I love Big.
Big is such a beautiful story, and it's all about play. And as adults, we forget to have fun in the work that we do. And I think it's just so refreshing as a reminder that, like, find your inner child in any aspect of your life and in any career. I mean, he was working at a toy company, so like easy. But just watching Tom Hanks as a kid who is an adult finding joy in the world of work is just a reminder that, like, we can find what we do in the world of work in our professional lives can and should be fun. And so tap into your inner child, especially when things get stressful or we create stress for ourselves.
Love it. What's something you never leave home without?
My phone.
One of them.
Yeah.
Where is an important place for you to go to find inspiration?
Oh, I love any water environment. So whether that be at a beach or a lake, I find a real sense of calm looking out on a body of water. And it does seem to clear my mind and I've had good ideas just sitting and looking out into the ocean. Similarly, I think the idea of like the shower idea, like when like something about water and the soothing nature of water, whether it's on your body or whether you're looking at it, does relax the mind, at least for me.
Amazing. What is the most important skill for a storyteller to develop?
Ooh, there's two. One is listening. I think you can't tell good stories unless you're listening to the people, the places, the things that you're looking to tell stories about. You have to be an active listener to reflect back the things that are going to be most resonant and to make sure you reflect things accurately. So being an excellent and active listener, and then also relationship building. I think that the thing about stories that are most impactful is that they create a connection between audience and what you're seeing on screen or reading. And that is about creating emotional impact, and that's about building relationship. So you're building a one-to-many relationship often when you're storytelling, but if you're a good relationship builder in real life, one-to-one, it absolutely translates into the way that you tell stories that you can have faith will have an impact on the audience that you're trying to reach.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This is fun.